Understanding the nature of information was central to Schrödinger's lectures 75 years ago. Today, we understand the answer to the question of how information is coded in the genome, but we only dance around the question of how information is coded in the brain. What is wrong with this question? It assumes that we are all talking about the same thing. We all know what we mean by the brain, but what do we really mean by information? If we found information in the brain or in the mind, what would it look like? What would it be made of? How would we read it? How would it evolve? Our understanding of information and its role in life is still both rudimentary and abstract. It is a frontier not just for science, but for engineering and for philosophy. And in this broad scope, our keynote speaker this evening is author, philosopher, and cognitive scientist, Professor Daniel Dennett. Dennett is the Austin B. Fletcher Professor of Philosophy at Tufts University in Boston. He originally took his BA at Harvard before doing his D.Phil at Oxford University under the mentorship of the late Gilbert Ryle. He has produced seminal philosophical works on the philosophy of mind, free will, epistemology, and philosophy of religion. His work uniquely incorporates evolutionary biology, cognitive science, and neuroscience. And he does this to create a paradigm of how to understand the nature and the origin of consciousness in a non-mystical way. Dennett has done this not just through academic writing, but also through 15 seminal books that are read by scientists and the general public, including Consciousness Explained, Breaking the Spell, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, and The Intentional Stance, amongst others. His most recent work, From Bacteria to Bach and Back, The Evolution of Minds, he offers a particularly adventurous perspective on the evolution of information, at least information in the broad sense, and how we can think about the future of our own evolution. And while reviewing this book, Mike Gazzaniga, who's one of our speakers tomorrow, summarized his opinion of it by saying, "This is the kind of book you read, relish, and read again." I've also read this particular book twice, though I can't honestly say so about Schrödinger's What is Life? There is no Nobel Prize for philosophy. But if there was, Professor Dennett would surely have already received it, though he doesn't need to. According to the late AI researcher Marvin Minsky, Dennett is our best current philosopher. He is the next Bertrand Russell. Unlike traditional philosophers, Dan is a student of neuroscience, linguistics, artificial intelligence, and computer science, and psychology. He is redefining the role of a philosopher. Dennett's approach to philosophy is different to most of his colleagues. He does not engage in theatrical debate. He is not aggressively argumentative or didactic. He doesn't go down narrow logical corridors of analysis, and he doesn't rely on overly artificial but logical discourse. He does not base his views on shaky premises. He starts, always, with science. His interests are diverse, and he becomes a near expert in any subfield of science that takes his interest. He learns the facts. He understands the crucial insights. He surveys the boundaries and familiarizes himself with the frontiers of the field and the challenges that lie there. Most crucially, he brings all of this knowledge together and then delivers new syntheses through his landmark works. He marshals the ideas, the questions, the theories into singular stories and worldviews. And he does this through plain English. Dennett's capacity for synthesis, for insightful and interdisciplinary, intercultural research puts him in a rare class of thinkers, scientists, and artists such as Sidney Brenner, Lynn Margulis, Ada Lovelace, Jocelyn Bell, James Joyce, Mary Wollstonecraft, David Bowie, and I think Erwin Schrödinger. The result of this is to introduce the reader to a new way of viewing the world, to see things as they evolved, and to gain a perspective of where we might be going in the future. And beyond the values to science of the scientific utility, it provides us with valuable cultural tools as well. Dennett is often lambasted by ideologically driven religious groups across the world for his work in promoting atheism. But his work, in my opinion, offers the most evidence-based but optimistic view of the world and of our own culture, because it shows most clearly how far we have come from higher primates to hunter-gatherers through nothing but our own resourcefulness, despite all our suffering, despite all of the challenges. We have brought ourselves here alone without any help. And even if sometimes we allow our more primitive instincts that have always been there to take over, and because we take our eye off the ball, we are all still here. And we can continue to develop our own evolution and our own culture, which is still in an extremely early stage, if we just keep talking and, as Dennett reminds us to always do, keep thinking. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce the Schrödinger at 75, What is Life? Keynote lecture. Please welcome to the stage Professor Daniel Dennett.
Thank you, Tomas, for that amazing introduction. I don't know how I could ever live up to it. I want to thank you and the other organizers and Trinity College for this amazing gathering, and say that it is a great honor to be part of it. But more than an honor, it's a great thrill. Today has been a feast of ideas and facts, and I am grateful to all the previous speakers for their thrilling talks, and we'll try to take a sort of bird's eye view on some of the talks. I prepared my slides last night, and I'm delighted to say that just about every speaker has anticipated my talk in some way and given me some illustrations, which I will try to point out as I go along. It's been a wonderful day. My title, The Future of Life, Tomas gave me that title, and I accepted it a little bit reluctantly, a little bit like Svante Pääbo, and he added the word research so that he could talk about the future of ancient DNA research. Well, I'm making the same move in a slightly different way. One thing we know about life is that it's changing in unpredictable ways, and the reason for that is that evolution is a noise amplifier. It takes events that are unpredictable, that happen to change the setting of the world in some way that then amplifies some differences and obliterates others. So it's a mug's game to try to predict the future of life. So I'm not going to try. But life as we know it is also changing, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Being a philosopher, I'm going to call these intentional objects. If this philosophical jargon is unfamiliar to you, I'll illustrate it with a few examples. Roughly, it's the things we believe in. You can have a book called The History of God that's written by an atheist. No difficulty with that. There are such books because it's the history of the intentional object, God. You could also, of course, write a book, The History of Santa Claus, perfectly legitimate scholarly exercise. You don't have to believe in Santa Claus to write that book, and there's be lots of information in it. Or think about the gold in Fort Knox. In the United States, we have this vast supply of gold in Fort Knox. It plays a role in our economy, but only because people believe it's there. It doesn't have any sort of magnetic or gravitational effect on the economy. It all cycles through people's beliefs. The intentional object, the gold in Fort Knox, that's the object that economists are interested in, and what I'm interested in today is the intentional object, life as we know it. Some of you may have heard of this woman. She lives on a neighboring island, and when I was a graduate student at Oxford many years ago, I heard a program on BBC Radio where small school children, I think they were kindergarten age, were very solemnly interviewed by the interviewer about Queen Elizabeth II. And their confident answers have stuck in my head ever since then. According to them, the Queen watches the telly while sitting on the throne with the crown on her head, and she hoovers Buckingham Palace wearing an ermine robe. And all these other details, a wonderful amalgam of mum and the actual Queen. And it hit me at the time that this Queen Elizabeth II, the Queen Elizabeth II of 6-year-old British children, was in some ways both more interesting and more politically potent than the actual woman. That's why I'm interested in intentional objects. So my topic is life, the intentional object. Now this is the cover of my original copy, old copy of the Schrödinger book. It cost 95 cents, I see, when I bought it. A thing to know about it, of course, is that now, 75 years after Schrödinger asked, there are still debates among very intelligent and well-informed people about whether the question, what is life, can be answered and whether it matters. Is it sometimes just a bad philosophical habit to ask for definitions? I think so. Should the habit be squelched on occasion? I think so. So I'm not going to define life. That's a fool's errand. I reread the book recently, and I got a new copy of, and somebody else already showed this cover of the more recent paperback edition of Schrödinger's What is Life, and I particularly like this cover because it reminds me of one of my favorite explanations of what Schrödinger's book is all about, and that was by my dear late friend Richard Gregory. The second law of thermodynamics, as you have often heard, one way of saying what the second law of thermodynamics asserts is that you can't unscramble an egg. And Richard Gregory said, oh, but you can. You can. You can unscramble an egg, and here's how you do it. First, you scramble the egg. Then you pour it in the black box, and after a little while, out comes an egg. What's in the black box? A chicken. And in a few simple sentences, that really encapsulates what Schrödinger's theory is all about. It's about the fighting against the second law of thermodynamics to create structure and information over time in a living thing. So I love this simple explanation of Gregory's, but of course it oversimplifies the wonderful analyses, the deductions, the speculations of Schrödinger's book. But Schrödinger also oversimplifies things in his book, and that's the beauty of it. So when is simplification oversimplification? What do you think? Neither. What I'm going to be talking about in the rest of my talk is the uses of oversimplification. Life depends on it, and so does life as we know it. Both life, the biosphere, and our concept of life. Here's one way of looking at the question I want to address. How did life ever create life as we know it? That is, beings that can conceive of life the way we do. Our intentional object, life as we know it. That intentional object that many in this room, the speakers today, have contributed so much to that understanding. We are intelligent designers. How did we come to be able to create life as we know it? That's what I want to talk about. Frogs are alive, and the frog's intentional object, life, is more impoverished than the children's intentional object, Queen Elizabeth II. They don't have much of a concept of life, and they don't need one. But we have, and we put it to great use. This is one of my favorite slides. On the left, you see an Australian termite castle. On the right, you see Gaudi's great La Sagrada Familia. They are stunningly similar in design, both internally and externally. The similarities run quite deep. They are both artifacts created by living things. They look very similar, but their method of construction and the R&D that went into them, the research and development, profoundly different. On the left, the termite castle is made by termites, who are pretty clueless. There is no architect termite, no. There's a queen termite, but she's more like the crown jewels than like a leader. There's no boss. There's no blueprint. There's no top-down. This is bottom-up construction, bottom-up design, designed by a process that is itself mindless and uncomprehending, natural selection. Gaudí, on the other hand, makes a very nice example because he's the quintessential, almost the caricature of the charismatic genius, the superintelligence who lords it over his underlings, who lord it over their underlings, who lord it over their underlings. This is top-down intelligent design. Small I, small d, but the very model of an intelligent designer. Two profoundly different ways of making something. And the question is, how do we get from bottom-up, competent but non-comprehending design processes to top-down, comprehending processes of design? In other words, how can a process with no intelligent designer create intelligent designers who can then design things that permit us to understand how a process with no intelligent designer can create intelligent designers who can then design things? Is this just a rhetorical question? Or does it point to an embarrassing contradiction in the theory of natural selection? No. But the answer takes some surprising turns. And they all deal with oversimplification. Here's a rule of thumb. When problems are difficult, this is what I tell my students this, when problems are difficult, blurt something out, then you have something to try to fix. And that's the first maxim of oversimplification. Blurt something out, and then you have something you can look at and study and think about and fix or throw away. That's what evolution does. In other words, oversimplify and then self-monitor. We have many examples of this. We have mutate and replicate. The mutation is blind, undirected. We have trial and error, which was discussed earlier today. We have, the more general term is generate and test. All of these are methods of designing where you try something, test it, and then try something else. One of my favorite examples, actually, is celestial navigation, which I learned as a boy, and it's now completely obsolete because of GPS. But here's how celestial navigation works. Here's how to make a cocked hat. A cocked hat is the small triangle, hopefully small triangle on your chart, which is, your boat is located in the middle of that cocked hat. That's what it's called. First, you make a guess. Then you correct it, thanks to the nautical almanac and your sextant sighting, and that lets you draw a line of position on your chart. You're somewhere on that line. We're making progress. Then you repeat steps 1 and 2. The sun's moved a little further. Make another reading. Draw another line. Then you repeat step 3. Make another line. When where the 3 lines intersect, you get a small triangle known as a cocked hat. Of course, if you were perfect, they would all intersect at a point, but there's always error. So the idea is to minimize your cocked hat. And you take that as your new position, your new geographic position. And of course, that's what your GPS system does too, just 1,000 times faster and more accurately. Maybe 1,000,000 times faster and more accurately. Haven't worked that out. That's where you are. Well, here's how to make a chicken. Take a dinosaur, let it replicate, select for flight worthiness, repeat steps 1, 2, and 3, repeat step 4 until you get a chicken. It's the same sort of process, slightly different scale, and a lot more repetitions. Oversimplification gets you into the arena where you can learn from your mistakes by working out the implications and doing a reality check. Now, some years ago, I provided a sort of caricature of 4 stages in this process. At the bottom stage, we have what I call Darwinian creatures. Darwinian creatures, here's a little schematic where we have 5 slightly different variants. They're different phenotypes, and they confront this sort of scary environment. And one of them does better than the others, and in the next generation, you see that it has the offspring, and the others have gone extinct. And so it goes. A very, very, very simplified picture of the algorithm of natural selection. Darwinian creatures. And there are Darwinian creatures, but they're Darwinian proto-creatures. Very simple, hardwired, can't learn anything, but they can evolve by these methods. Next rung on the ladder I called Skinnerian creatures, and B.F. Skinner, the great behaviorist, famously saw that his model of learning, the reinforcement learning, was an analog, a strong analog of natural selection. Here you have a single creature who has 5 behavioral options, doesn't know which one to do, tries them all in some random order, and gets reinforced by something in the environment. You need a reinforcement signal, of course, to do this, but you need a reward. We were hearing about rewards, and if you get a reward, then that's the one you do in the future. So those are Skinnerian creatures. They're examples of things which engage in reinforcement learning of the kind that Murray Shanahan was just talking about. But Skinnerian creatures have the problem that they have to risk their trials in the real world, and if they make a mistake, they may not get to make another trial. So a better creature is a Popperian creature. I was very glad to hear my predecessor on the stage talk about Karl Popper. I call these Popperian creatures because he once said that we permit our hypotheses to die in our stead. And what this inspires is the idea that if you want to do better than a Skinnerian creature, what you want to have is a sort of model of the world in your head that you carry around with you, where you can test out your hypotheses before you try them in the cruel real world. So a Popperian creature has an inner selective environment. It's not actually, it's like a mathematical model. It's something that yields predictions when you try things out in it. And then that means that a Popperian creature is more likely to make an adaptive first move than a merely Skinnerian creature. It tries things offline before it tries them in the cruel world. But that's not the end of it. There's one more, and it's the Gregorian creatures, named after my late lamented friend, Richard Gregory, the wonderful British psychologist. And Gregory made a wonderful point about how tools, even things as simple as a pair of scissors, how they actually give us more intelligence. They make us smarter. It's not just you have to be smart to use them, your use of them makes you smarter. And so what Richard Gregory pointed out is that we don't all have to reinvent calculus and maps and addition and subtraction and cost-benefit analysis and Bayesian statistics. We get all these wonderful tools ready-made. We download them from the environment, and that makes us smart. And we use these tools. And these are, in fact, the key. This is the key step to answering my question. And we have to look, of course, at the transitions between them. And again, oversimplification is the key. That is, it's not a magic step that takes you from Skinnerian to Popperian or from Popperian to Gregorian. The idea we need, I think, comes best from James Gibson, and it's the concept of an affordance. An affordance is what the environment offers the animal for good or ill. It's a hole to hide in, a window to look out, food to eat, a tree to climb, whatever you need, depending on your opportunities, your physiology, and the perils of your world. And this is nature's way of oversimplifying. Find something important and track it. Evolution provides organisms with affordance trackers. Just the ones they need, no extras, only the ones that are of paramount importance to their welfare. Don't worry about getting it right every time. Good enough for government work. You get it, you use it, and what it does is it gives you time to improve. It gives you a little breathing room so that you can get a little help, and sometimes you'll have false positives. You don't worry about those too much. And so, over time, the affordance trackers are tuned by evolution to improve the fate of those organisms that are the beneficiaries. They don't have to understand them. That's very important. They don't have to understand that they've got these trackers. They just rely on them, and they do very well. I've been thinking about how to make clear what affordances are, and I thought it might help if we thought about it from a human point of view instead of from the point of view of C. elegans or E. coli or a rat. Think of, wouldn't it be nice if we could just perceive all the things that matter to us? And so many things matter to us. In the future, you might be able to wear a device or implant one that labels everything in the world that matters to you. So there you are, you're walking down the street, and what might matter to you? Well, what might matter to you is that there's a doctor somewhere nearby, or maybe a lawyer. But you know, how do you tell if you're just walking down the street? Who's a doctor? Who's a lawyer? Well, what does a lawyer look like? Well, they come in all sorts of flavors. So you're not going to do this by any simple, direct visual test. There's no Hubel and Wiesel cell or system of cells that's going to tell you what a lawyer looks like, but it would be not so hard for Google. They're already working on this. So they could design something so that when you looked at the street, you wore your Google Glass, and the lawyers would just be labeled automatically for you by the data cloud that surrounded them, and there's a pickpocket, and you'd want to know that too. But of course, if Google did that, they wouldn't use writing. They could in the cheap, oversimplified first version. They would probably find some other symbol that would do the trick. And of course, in the end, you don't need a symbol at all. All you need to do is to hook the tracker up with the right responses, and you get the effect of the affordance tracking without any rendering in symbols at all. And that's what nature has done. We might think of this as an enhancement of human perceptual capacities, but it's really just an extension of the very sort of thing that nature's been doing for several billion years. Nature's already done this. Now, if you had one of those devices, you might get so used to this user-friendly innovation that if you lost your device, you'd feel you'd been struck blind. And in fact, in a certain sense, you would. If you want to know what the colors and aromas and shapes and all of the macroscopic properties of the world we live in really are, they are the properties that matter to us as large, several trillion cell entities, and they have been honed to be user-friendly for us, given the brains that we have. I want to look at a few more oversimplifications. 4 in particular, Mendel and beanbag genetics. Nobody's mentioned Mendel today. The McCulloch-Pitts logical neuron. Shannon information, Claude Shannon was mentioned. And good old-fashioned AI. Here are 4 oversimplifications that I think we're all greatly indebted to. Let's start with Mendel and beanbag genetics. Without Mendel, it's hard to imagine Crick and Watson. But then we go from gene centrism to evo-devo, and then we have segregation disorders and transposons and methylation and all the other wonderful things that we've been hearing about today. But it all goes back to the blessedly easy to understand oversimplifications of Mendel. Hardy-Weinberg and all those simplifications which we learn to throw away when we get more sophisticated. Well, now let's look at the McCulloch-Pitts logical neuron. This is the oversimplification that changed my life. On the left, we see an old diagram of a neuron. On the right, we see a McCulloch-Pitts logical neuron of 1943. And when I first saw a diagram of that, which was in 1963, Shazam, it hit me like a ton of bricks. You could put these things together into a machine that could learn, that could bootstrap itself up from an initial beginning and create learning as a kind of evolution in the brain. That's what I've been pursuing ever since. Murray Shanahan has already explained the threshold-gated logical neuron and how it's the basis for later work in AI. It was an existence proof of sorts, an entirely explicable mechanical network of mindless units can be designed to compute any computable function. That swept away a whole strand of mystery that we didn't have to worry about anymore. It grounded work by Frank Rosenblatt on the perceptron in 1957, which was the basis for connectionism, which Murray talked to you about a little later, and today's deep learning. Great. But here's some actual neurons in action. They're not much like a McCulloch-Pitts logical neuron. This is a simplification that we have to learn to live without. Shannon information, another simplification. Here's Shannon's original diagram from 1948, where you have a transmitter and a receiver, and this is all a designed system, and there's a source of noise. And what Shannon said was, think of this as a theory of intelligently designed artifacts with senders and receivers. and no meaning. No meaning. It was just codes. It was just getting the code from point A to point B, but without concern with what the code might be about or what it meant. A shocking oversimplification in some ways, and yet in other ways, the most important simplification we've had in 100 years. I like to remind people that there's more Shannon information in 5 minutes of Teletubbies than in the Encyclopedia Britannica. If you want to count bytes and megabytes. It's still one of the key ideas in the computer age. We're just now, finally, I think, beginning to come together on how to understand what is sometimes called semantic information, information about things in the world, and basing that on Shannon's original ideas. But that's work in progress. One more oversimplification, good old-fashioned AI. And I'm delighted to say that Murray introduced this too in talking about John McCarthy, one of my heroes and late friends as well, who created this is my caricature of good old-fashioned AI, the walking encyclopedia. It's all done with logical propositions. You have a language where you write down everything in a strict logical form, and then you have your resolution theorem prover that cranks out theorems from the axioms, and you prove everything by deduction, and you try to do that fast enough so you don't walk into walls or off the edge of cliffs. Not a good idea in some ways, but a brilliant idea in others. If we hadn't had good old-fashioned AI, I think we would still be waving our hands about options which have proven this isn't going to be the way to do it. You have to remember that failures by very smart people on very ambitious projects, those are real landmarks, really important. Good old-fashioned AI closed off a lot of otherwise extremely tempting, seductive avenues of research and led through AI winters, as Murray was saying, to later moves. What was wrong with good old-fashioned AI? Well, one thing that was wrong with it was that it was top-down design. It was designed by intelligent designers. And what they did was they used worst-case scenarios to design the architectures, and that created Y2K problems, although at a much bigger scale. You remember the Y2K problem arose because somebody decided we only need a few registers to hold the date. And it turned out they were forgetting about the fact that the century was going to change and everything was going to have to be rewritten. And you had to take apart a lot of software and put it back together because there was this unadjustable limit which had been determined by somebody's idea of a worst-case scenario. Well, that affects good old-fashioned AI in a big way. It highlighted, however, many important features. I'll just mention two: self-monitoring itself and the idea of credit assignment. The idea that when something goes wrong, you want to know who to blame or who to credit. Self-monitoring is another way of looking at one of the important steps in this procedure. Trees notice things. Bacteria notice things. But they don't notice that they notice things. Or if they do, sort of, they don't notice that they notice things. It's this reflexive, recursive power of noticing what you're noticing and noticing that you're noticing what you're noticing that gives rise to the perspective that permits Gaudi-style intelligent design. That's where self-monitoring comes in. The rueful phrase, "well, it seemed like a good idea at the time," is often used as a sort of jokey reference to some idiotic, rueful reflection. But I want to say, on the contrary, Anybody who can say that and mean it and understand it has one of the key marks of intelligence. Not only can you recall what you thought at the time, you can evaluate it in the light of subsequent events. The very fact that you can entertain that train of thought is a sign that you're well on your way to being an intelligent designer. In other words, we want not just Popperian creatures, but retrospective Popperian creatures with memory for their own evaluations. That way they can improve their own thinking about their thinking, about their thinking, and so forth. So back to my original contrast between the termites and Gaudi. Here's a puzzle. A termite colony might be 70 million clueless termites, and a brain, who's counting, 80, 86 billion clueless neurons. Now, how do you get a Gaudi-type mind out of a termite colony brain? There's no boss neuron in there. There's no king neuron. There's no res cogitans of Descartes in there moving the neurons around. How do you get neurons, which are individually even more clueless than termites, to join into forces that permit you to get a Gaudi-type mind? That's a real puzzle. And here's an oversimplified answer. You can't do much carpentry with your bare brain, and you can't do much thinking with your bare... You can't do much carpentry with your bare hands, and you can't do much thinking with your bare brain. My friend Bo Dalban once said that, and I think it's a very deep fact about thinking. A termite colony is a bare brain, doesn't have any thinking tools. Intelligent designers have well-equipped brains. When did they get their tools? Very, very recently. If you see that little branch there, that's about 6 million years on each branch. That's about as long as we've evolved from our common ancestor with the chimpanzee. But having thinking tools is a much more recent event than that. So in the whole history of life on the planet, organisms with thinking tools, the way we have, are an absolute novelty. They've only been around for the blink of an eye. And how did they get their tools? Well, here's the wrong answer. Technology is a gift of God. After the gift of life, it is perhaps the greatest of God's gifts. It is the mother of civilizations, of arts, and of sciences. That's Freeman Dyson. And everything in that sentence is true, I think, except the first sentence. It's not a miraculous gift from God. It's a gradual, non-genetic transmission of information, for instance, via the Baldwin effect. And interestingly enough, Schrödinger himself got it. Here's what he said. The causal connection is not what Lamarck thought it to be, rather just the other way around. It's not that the behavior changes the physique of the parents, and by physical inheritance that of the offspring. It is that this change in behavior is, by example or teaching, or even more primitively, transmitted to the progeny along with the physical change carried by the genome. Nay, even if the physical change is not yet an inheritable one, the transmission of the induced behavior by teaching can be a highly efficient evolutionary factor because it throws the door open to receive future inherited mutations with a prepared readiness to make the best use of them and thus to subject them to intense selection. He had that. Of course, he was not the first to have that. Baldwin had it first. The long answer is that cultural evolution designed thinking tools that impose novel structures on our brains. These are evolved virtual machines that we download into our neck tops. And that's the source of our power and versatility. But our brains are computers, but not like your laptop or smartphone. They're not composed of billions of identical, intelligently designed flip-flops, but of billions of evolved cells with agendas of their own. And Schrödinger got that too. The cell, as a component of the body, is not only a visibly demarcated unit, but a unit life centered on itself. It leads its own life. In other words, go-fi is not what's inside. It's something very different. Very quickly, I will summarize one more idea, which Schrödinger anticipated. I've already mentioned McCulloch and Pitts for the McCulloch-Pitts neuron, and Jerry Letvin was a brilliant and very funny neuroscientist, but this classic paper by Letvin, Maturana, McCulloch, and Pitts, What the Frog's Eye Tells a Frog's Brain, came out in 1959, and its second author was Umberto Maturana, the Chilean thinker and guru, and he created the term autopoiesis. He and Varela, his Chilean co-author, wrote an interesting book about this in 1980. More recently, Terry Deacon at Berkeley came out with a book called Incomplete Nature. And basically what they're doing is rediscovering an idea that is also in Schrödinger and building it out. Here's what Schrödinger said in Mind and Matter. Speaking without metaphor, we have to declare that we are here faced with one of these typical antinomies caused by the fact that we have not yet succeeded in elaborating a fairly understandable outlook on the world without retiring our own mind, the producer of the world picture, from it, so that mind has no place in it. That was true in 1956 when he wrote it, and it's still true today, but we're working on it. Thanks for your attention.